How to draw without guidelines. Really talking about how to draw without a pencil underdrawing. Here are two recent drawings that took about 25 minutes each in real life that I've drawn directly freehand in ink without any guidelines or underdrawing at all. Two 25-minute drawings in 60 seconds each. Now, 3 years ago, this is not how I drew. I used a 4x4 grid as a reference on my drawing paper and on my photo. And I drew a detailed pencil underdrawing as a guide to my finished ink work. I'd drawn that way for about 3 years, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that for two main reasons, I really wanted to be able to draw without any guidelines whatsoever. Now, I knew of no teaching on this, so I just began to try and persevered and work out a technique that would work for me, that would overcome all the difficulties I faced in switching from the 4x4 grid and pencil underdrawing to directly freehand. And this video are the things that I worked out of how to change how I thought and what I did to be able to, I think, draw successfully directly without these guidelines. And if you watch any of my drawing videos, and I have about, well over 500 of them, then you'll be able to watch me put into practice in each of those in some way the techniques that I'm about to outline now. What were my two reasons for wanting to draw without any guidelines? Firstly, there was a big trip to Europe planned, and I wanted to be able to sit in the street and sketch in ink, not having to worry and fuss with a pencil and erasing. Unfortunately, COVID put an end to that, but I kept up with the process. And the second reason was a creeping perfectionism. As my drawing improved, I became more and more demanding that everything had to be perfect in the underdrawing. And, well, this was taking, in the end, all the joy from my drawing experience. So I decided to make it impossible to become so perfectionistic. I would draw directly in ink with no chance of erasing. So let me explain in more detail the way I've switched from drawing with a guideline to without one. I think all of the things that made my drawing without guidelines possible fall into two main areas. The first are the things that all happen in my mind, the things that I don't actually need to hold a pen in my hand for. And the second area are all the things where I am holding the pen. However, don't be impatient to get to the practical things, because they can only happen, they can only flow if the things in our mind, the things that we do without the pencil, have already happened. In fact, I think the more challenging shift is actually the shift in our thinking that has to take place, because in the end, everything we do flows from how we are thinking. The first thing that had to happen was I had to develop a different way of thinking of the drawing process and of mistakes. Drawing with a pencil underdrawing, it was easy to think that the drawing process was me copying my reference as accurately as possible. And therefore, when my pencil lines weren't accurate enough, I would erase them and redraw them, erase them and redraw them. And only when they were correct was I able to continue with the drawing with the inking over the top. So mistakes became a strong focus. They became this thing that I had to work really hard to avoid and to correct if I made them. It made drawing a very black and white process, and mistakes something to be feared. It often meant I got stuck in a certain part of the drawing, erasing, redrawing, which psychologically began to make it a very unpleasant experience for me. However, to be able to draw without any underdrawing, to draw directly in ink, I had to change my thinking on this. I had to see every mark I put on the paper as part of the drawing process, even ones that weren't as exact in their placement or in their effect as I would have liked. Now, I had to learn to put them on the paper in a different way with a different mindset. But even so, there was still going to be marks and lines that weren't where I really wanted them to be. I had to learn not to think I've ruined the drawing. I had to come to understand the drawing is not a series of marks all precisely drawn in some exactitude. But the drawing in the end is the sum total of all the marks I put on the paper. And it's not any one, it's the total effect. And marks that I haven't placed perhaps as accurately as I would have liked can be worked in, worked around, can be mitigated against. That the impact they have in the end is not nearly the same as the way it looks when I first realized that shouldn't be there. When the wrong mark in the wrong place is looking at me, it actually becomes easier now to put the correct mark in because I can reference off the one that I know is not quite how I want it to be. What the, if you like, mistakes end up doing is giving me direction as to where I need to work at improving my thinking and my technique. So I shifted from being terrified of mistakes to seeing them as my friends. They help me understand where I need to put more attention, more effort, more practice. Second area, I think, is to improve on our observation abilities. Now, I'm always going on about observation, but it's even more important when there's no going back, when there's no second chance. I need to see all the things I need to see to be able to make the right choices, to be able to use the techniques, the strategies that I'm going to have to actually put the ink on the paper. I have to see everything I need to see in my reference, in front of me, or even in my imagination to do this most successfully. The problem is the things we need to see for drawing are not the same things we need to see in the same way most of the time for everyday life. So the habits, the practices I've developed for observation for what feels like it's enough or appropriate actually become misleading when I draw because I need to see often different things and in far more detail. And the problem is if I start putting ink on paper when there's no going back for every one of those marks, before I've really observed what I need to see, then I'm going to be creating a lot of things that may just work against the overall scene that I'm trying to produce. I have a playlist on observation. It's such an important area. I truly believe that a lot of what people think are drawing problems are actually observation problems. The third area that became very important for me to consider was to visualize what I was going to put on the paper before I put it. Now, that's at every stage of the process. That's visualizing where lines and key elements are going to appear. It's visualizing the forms that I'm placing and their relationship to each other, the things I'm about to draw with the things I've already drawn on the paper, visualizing, seeing in my mind, seeing on the paper before I put them there. It kind of gives me, if you like, an imaginative underdrawing. It increases my accuracy before I put the marks on the paper. But I'm not just visualizing the, if you like, the next mark. I'm doing my best to visualize as many downstream marks that I have to do, as many techniques that I'm yet to employ in my drawing as I possibly can at the same time. And there's a part of me that's visualizing how I hope my drawing will look at the end, so that every mark, every bit of ink I put on my drawing surface can hopefully work towards producing that end product. I don't want to be putting too much ink, too many marks in one place if it's going to unbalance the overall effect that I'm wanting to have. Because things such as values are read off other values, I don't want to go too dark in an area that's not going to be the darkest area, because then I may have to go darker than I want in the area that needs to be the darkest area. If I'm doing a pencil underdrawing, then with so much of this, I can just erase things that I decide aren't working. Drawing directly without any underdrawing, I need to be making these decisions as I go. And the final point before we pick up the pen is to do with having worked out my overall drawing strategy before I start to draw. But certainly at the start, I had to really plot where I would start and how I would progress my drawing, to at least have the first number of steps very clear in my mind, so that I wasn't doing things that at some later stage I realized weren't helpful, were counterproductive, put lines in the wrong place for things that I wanted then to draw in that place later. Having to plan very carefully the progress, the staging of what I started with, and then how I moved around the drawing from that. If I'm doing an underdrawing with a pencil, certainly if I'm using a grid, I can start anywhere and draw anything at any stage. So now we come to the techniques that concern the ink hitting the paper. And I think the most important thing is to choose the starting point with a great deal of intention. because what I draw first isn't just my starting point, it isn't just the start of the drawing, but it's actually going to become the reference point for the rest of the drawing. If you like, it becomes the ruler that I measure everything else from. So I want it to be as accurate, particularly in its proportions, as I can possibly make it. Because inaccuracies are going to be like using a ruler where the gap between each of the measurements is different. In practice, for me, drawing a lot of architecture, this means that I choose a part of a building that's relatively simple, preferably even rectangular, where it's going to be easiest to get the height and the width proportions as faithful to the original reference as possible. If you look at some of my drawing videos, including the two in the introduction, pay particular attention to what I choose to start with, because I'm not just starting in the middle or at the top or at the side. I'm actually starting at the point I believe I've got the best chance of drawing as accurately, as easily as possible. And then from there, to measure as I move out, to judge distance and height and angles from the very starting point I do. An important technique point that flows from that is to choose to do whatever detail needs to be done in this very start process, this very early stage, that needs to be done to help read the proportions accurately. Often we have a larger shape, but there might be a window in it, there might be half a doorway in it, and it's only when we actually position the doorway that we can really judge, or put the window in, that we can really judge whether the overall shape is accurate. Which brings us to the next technique point, which is don't try and draw, in my experience, too much at once in terms of overall outline. Now, when we draw with an underdrawing, when we draw erasing, a very popular technique, a very popular way of doing it is to block out the big shapes and then refine them as we place the detail. Now that's fine when we can erase. It's a great technique when we erase, because blocking out not in the right place, we can change. If we block out and find the detail doesn't position accurately in proportion, we can change that. We can change anything at all we like. But we don't have that luxury. So we need to observe a reference more carefully, see all the things we need to see. We need to visualize how it's going to look on the paper, where the boundaries of this section are going to be to create the right proportions. I find very helpful at this point, let me tell you, to put a lot of dots on the paper to help me visualize where I think the corners are going to be, or how far I think this section is going to come out to. And then I also try and visualize whatever detail is within that to help me see that it's going to fit everything in the right way. However, while in the early stages, we may need to add detail to help us judge the proportions of some of the earlier segments that we draw. Generally speaking, we don't want to get bogged down in detail that we don't need to draw, because one of the artistic technique decisions we need to make as we draw is how we adjust the amount of detail over the whole scene. And we can't really do that effectively until we've drawn enough of the scene that we can now start to, if you like, fill in the parts and not just worry about this bit being accurate, this bit being accurate, but how we can draw all of this now together and bring out a cohesive whole that captures whatever creative vision we had for our drawing based from this reference. And it's not just going too hard too quickly in certain parts with the detail, drawing detail that we may not really want there at the end, but it's going too dark too quickly with the values. Values is just the art word for lights and darks. And how we read, how we understand how light or dark something looks is in relation to the other lights and darks. So if I go too dark, if I put too much hatching in one area, that's not the darkest area in the reference in my finished drawing, that can mean that I've now got to go darker than I really want to go in the part that is meant to be darker. Or it may now throw out all the balance of lights and darks, and compositionally may now fight against what effect I'm trying to have in the overall scene. So certainly do some hatching to help bring the 3 dimensions and a sense of where we're going, but avoid going too hard, too dark, too quickly in the early stages of the drawing. Tweaking the hatching to the final values really is one of the things we do in the final stages of a drawing, I think, to be able to do it most effectively. Now, when it comes to getting angles correct, again, drawing them directly in ink, we can't go back and change it once it's there. So we want to be a bit cautious in positioning these. What I usually do is I just observe carefully and I put a dot where I think the line will go to create the angle I want. And I just try and visualize a line there. I look at my reference again and think, is that going to work? But what I usually then do is I get my pen, this stick will have to do, I get my pen, I form the angle, and then I slide it across to my reference, which I've aligned on the horizontal with my drawing, till my pen or stick comes over the same angle in the photo. And now I can assess, is the angle the same? If my pen is like this, but in the reference the line's like this, I know I need to make my dot a bit lower down to make the angle slightly more shallow, and so forth. If I'm drawing on location, so I have my subject in front of me, I can bring my pen up in front of me, shut one eye, line it up, not with a photo, but with the actual object in front of me, and then just bring it straight down on the paper. Or if I'm doing it sideways, it looks really bodgy, but it's incredibly accurate, surprisingly accurate. It's well worth the effort of refining our ability to do this. This next technique is particularly important when we're drawing without guidelines, a streetscape, where we have buildings of several stories or many stories. We have a street level with lampposts, telegraph poles, garbage bins, bus stops, people, cars. We have many layers going back towards the front of the building. I find in these drawings the best way to strategize my actual process is to not start at ground level with anything, but to actually start at the first floor or even higher, depending where I can get that starting shape most accurately. So I draw a large section, maybe the entire building above the ground floor level. Now I've got a lot of reference to help me judge the scale, the relative size of, say, the people against the building, the bus stop, the cars against the building, against the other people. Otherwise, we can have a lot of problem. If we start with these figures in front, it can be very hard to get the scale correct between all these very different objects. And it's also easy simply to draw them too large, and then we have to draw our building ridiculously large and it won't fit on the paper, or the scale of our building ends up being inconsistent with the scale of the foreground clutter, as I often think of it. The other thing I do is, once I've drawn the top of the building and I'm now coming down to the foreground clutter, I draw whatever's in front of what's behind, and then I draw what's behind so it comes down to meet it. Usually trying to leave the slightest half mil or less gap between one object and the other, just to help make one feel like it sits forward a little bit more. Again, if you watch any of the drawings which have a streetscape element, you'll see me do it this way over and over again. If I try and draw the whole building before I draw the foreground objects, it's really easy just to have things overlapping. And that's never an effective look. And if I'm drawing without any underdrawing directly in ink, I need to be really aware of depth of plane, of distance. Because for me at least, the way I can create a sense of depth, of distance from foreground to distance through various midground levels in my drawings, means I have to know where the depth of plane is at every point. I need to know which things across the whole width of my scene are at the same depth of plane, so I can draw them with similar pens in a similar drawing style with a similar amount of detail, with similar sorts of edges, so that they read consistently as the effect of depth goes backwards. Of course, my paper's two-dimensional. There is no depth really, but I want to create the, if you like, optical illusion of depth. And I can only do that when there's no erasing possible. If I know what I'm trying to do, as soon as my pen for that particular object hits the paper. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you'd like to switch from drawing with an underdrawing and discover the freedom and the growth in drawing confidence that comes from drawing without any guidelines, without the possibility of erasing, and to challenge yourself to learn what at the start can be a more difficult technique, but which I think in the end opens up so many possibilities for us for drawing, particularly if we hope to do location sketching. Then these are the ways I've learnt to think and I've learnt to draw to make it possible. Check out some of my drawing videos and you'll see me put all of these principles into practice. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. So hope this has been very helpful. But look, in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.